corpses bearing marks of torture dumped by the side of the road at night.
It's a war in northern Mexico. Two factions of the same criminal group, the Sinaloa Cartel, in open conflict. Between them, they're tearing up parts of the city of Culiacan.
Since El Mayo's arrest, the Sinaloa cartel has spiraled into a full-blown civil war, with dead bodies showing up every passing minute. Over 100 people, including 2 mayors, have been killed in just a few weeks, and that's just in the Sinaloa region. And if that's not terrifying enough, the cartels have also given their members a new order to Border Patrol agents on site. But patrol agents are not even the only target. Just last month, cartel gunmen brutally murdered a U.S. Marine veteran in Sonora. Now you see, no one is safe on either side of the border, and it's only going to get worse because their ultimate goal is to take over the U.S. border, and more lives will be lost in the process.
Texas authorities warning Americans not to travel to Mexico during spring break because of the risk of cartel violence.
Well, Mexican drug cartels are not shy about making their presence known along the southern border to the point where they are turning everyday border towns into all-out war zones.
The southern U.S. border may seem a world away to many Americans, but behind the political expression lies a brutal underworld dominated by Mexico's ruthless drug cartels. Their multi-billion-dollar human smuggling trade relies on exploitation and control of migrants seeking to illegally cross into the United States. For years, their operations went unchecked as they illegally transferred thousands across the border each month. But growing security efforts have severely held back the cartel's trafficking business, making them more ruthless. They are willing to go to violent extremes to protect their area, burning barricades, sprayed bullets, armed interceptions. These terrifying cartel tactics target any threats to their border access. Masked gunmen emerge swiftly from the brush to aggressively deter those trying to capture their terrain. Today, in this video, we'll look into this lawless world at the border, revealing what happens when innocent civilians or bold journalists get in contact with ruthless cartels. We'll uncover the vast smuggling networks being disrupted by increased security along the border. And we'll see why Mexico's most vicious cartels are enraged by the U.S. impacting their billion-dollar human trafficking empires. The cartels are ruthlessly determined to maintain dominance of the border at all costs.
But as we know, there are currently thousands of Central American migrants waiting at our southern border trying to enter the United States. This is not a new phenomenon. Regardless of which party is controlled, Republican or Democrat, we've dealt with sudden influxes of migrants for decades.
The U.S.-Mexico border has long been a major route for illegal drugs and human trafficking operations run by Mexican cartels. However, in recent years, increased security and border control measures have made it much more difficult for the cartels to move their forbidden goods across the border. This has severely impacted the cartels' profits and operations. As a result, the cartels are extremely unhappy with the increase in security along the U.S.-Mexico border. Over the past few decades, the U.S. government has dramatically increased security and control measures along the southern border. This includes the construction of extensive border fencing, the deployment of advanced surveillance technology, and a huge increase in the number of Border Patrol agents. The U.S. Border Patrol has also divided the southern border into sectors and deployed targeted surge operations to heavily patrol and crack down on busy smuggling corridors. Joint operations between U.S. and Mexican authorities have also helped capture cartel members on both sides of the border. This massive border security buildup has directly interfered with the cartels and their criminal operations. Whereas the border was once relatively easily accessible and easy to get around, it is now filled with layered defenses that make illegal cross-border activities far more challenging. One of the biggest blows to the Mexican cartels has been the disruption of drug trafficking across the U.S. border. Smuggling illicit drugs into the United States has long been one of the most profitable enterprises for the cartels. But as we mentioned, this increase of security at the border has made trafficking and smuggling much more riskier and difficult.
What we got going on here?
They're letting fentanyl across the border. They're letting cocaine across the border.
Did you let any fentanyl across?
Did you stop anybody?
These drug seizures show that smuggling operations are frequently detected and intercepted at the border before reaching their destinations inside the U.S. This means the cartels are losing valuable products and profits. And adding to this, the people smuggling these drugs are also being arrested more frequently, putting a dent to their smuggling networks. In response to the increased security, the cartels have been trying to shift drugs through alternative ports of entry and smuggling techniques. Cartels will try to conceal drugs in vehicles or send individual smugglers carrying drugs on foot across remote areas of the border. Traffickers are also using elaborate tunnels to move drugs under the border. Yet despite these efforts, the overall ability of cartels to push large drug loads across the border has still been highly constrained. In addition to illegal drugs, the Mexican cartels have also specialized in smuggling and trafficking people across the US border. But the US government's border crackdown has also come in the middle of these illicit immigration operations.
This massive influx of migrants has left large swaths of the border in Eagle Pass unpatrolled, literally unpatrolled.
The US-Mexico border has become a hotbed of activity in recent years as migrants seeking a better life look to cross into America. This rise in immigration has led to clashes between activists looking to provide humanitarian aid and those intent on stopping the flow of migrants.
With more than 12,000 illegal immigrants entering the U.S. border per day. In towns like Eagle Pass, Texas earlier in December, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has responded by installing over 100 miles of razor wire fence along the border and an estimated 700,000 protesters known as the Take Our Border Back convoy is on its way to this small border town to defend America from an illegal immigrant invasion.
Most of these Haitian migrants had spent their life savings and taken out massive loans from shady sources, later revealed to be Mexican cartels. The cartels operate an underground economy that's run on human exploitation, charging desperate migrants unimaginable fees, upward of $10,000 per person for transferring to America. Many migrants find themselves trapped in dirty and filthy stash houses, stuffed in with 100 other people as they await to get transferred across the border. The cartels purposely keep them in inhumane conditions, using their fear and debt bondage to retain their control. Uncontrolled illnesses spread rapidly due to the unsanitary conditions, but the migrants cling to hope, seeing the crossing into America as their last lifeline. These migrants were following proper channels, requesting asylum at particular ports of entry on the border. However, the asylum process involved huge delays, with appointments backlogged for 4 or 6 months. This leaves migrants stuck in places like Tijuana for months on end, unable to work and vulnerable to the same cartels that charge huge smuggling fees. The cartels run extensive human trafficking and kidnapping rings in northern Mexico as well, making profits on desperate migrants uncertain of their future life. While asylum seekers undergo never-ending wait times, the cartels continue to profit off their helplessness.
Well, what it comes down to is these individuals that are crossing, they know that when they come through Mexico from different parts of the world, they're going to have to go in contact with the drug cartels. They're going to have to get in contact with the smugglers. So they're the ones that are going to control what's coming across, what's not.
The cartels operate with military precision, positioning scouts along the border to identify gaps and communicate with traffickers regarding timing. These scouts then signal traffickers when it's safe to move migrants across. America's broken immigration system allows the cartels to operate freely. They have adapted to increased security by expanding smuggling routes, using military technology like drones and encrypted communications, and recruiting elite enforcement gangs from Mexican special forces. As security tightens in one area, the distribution channels flexibly and rapidly shift to new sectors, routes, and gaps along the vast 2,000-mile US-Mexico border. The Mexican cartels have extensive operations facilitating illegal border crossings into the United States. As we mentioned before, most of these migrants pay the cartels steep fees, often taking out loans they cannot repay, leaving them trapped by the cartels. The cartels bribe government officials, including police, to allow their operations to continue. A major driver is the U.S. demand for undocumented migrant workers who can be exploited and underpaid compared to legal workers. Climate change pursuers, gang violence, and instability from U.S. policies also push many migrants to risk the dangerous illegal crossing controlled by cartels. When authorities increase security, the cartels quickly adapt routes. For example, building 100 miles of tall fences in Texas reduced crossings in that area. But the cartels soon found new entry points. The cartels take advantage of migrants' desperation to control and profit immensely from the illicit human smuggling across the US-Mexico border. But the cartels just shifted their routes. They cut new holes in the fence in remote areas. Or they moved their operations to parts of California and Arizona with less security.
Live in Tacoma, California today. Bill, obviously we've seen a push to this direction since Texas tightened its own border. Now people are looking for other open spots, and they're ending up in California.
It's the first time I've ever seen this in my coverage of the border. Take a look up on this mountain right here. This is in Tacoma. This is a huge, rocky, steep mountain. It might be hard. We're trying to zoom in. There is literally like an ant trail of illegal immigrants coming down this valley, this crevice in this mountain right now, walking down and coming down to the bottom here, waiting to be apprehended by Border Patrol.
While politicians claim victories, the sophisticated Mexican cartels still control much of the 2,000-mile US-Mexico border. The cartels ruthlessly fight back against border crackdowns through violence against agents, journalists, and activists. Their reach extends far beyond Mexico as they traffic migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Asia, and beyond. The border situation has no easy solution. It involves complex trade-offs that get oversimplified in political battles over national identity and immigration. While partisan conflicts rage, there are human realities at the border often overlooked. Migrant families face violence, poverty, and harsh policies that treat them as political pawns, rather than people with dignity. Children just want their most basic needs for food, shelter, and safety met. Progress requires seeing our shared humanity across divides of citizenship. However, in certain places, tensions flare between hard-line enforcement and activist claims of human rights violations. Opening minds to complexities, not closing them with fixed positions, is the first step to solving the cycles of cruelty and needless suffering at the border.
Right now, a convoy is making its way across southeast Texas in protest of the Biden administration's border policies. Organizers are calling it the Take Our Border Back convoy. They stopped by Dripping Springs, a rural town 30 minutes outside of Austin today, to hold what they're calling a peaceful First Amendment gathering. Group leaders argue the Biden administration needs to do more to address security at the border. The protest comes as the standoff over border enforcement between Texas and the federal government intensifies.
Activist groups like Take Our Border Back hold rallies accusing the government of keeping borders open on purpose. To them, every migrant crossing represents dishonest attempts to increase Democratic votes. They call for deadly restraints like electrified fences and crocodile pits, seeking to permanently seal the border through force. Of course, the cartels avoid these efforts through their Haji resources and tactical agility. As seen in San Isidro, California, armed Mexican officers secured a major breach, so the cartels simply changed their route, establishing new gaps through rugged California desert. Politicians celebrate fleeting victories, but the easily exploited border remains dotted with hidden migrant camps under cartel control. Traffickers motivated by profits will stop at nothing to protect this pipeline. Migrants risk the dangerous journey because American businesses continue hiring them. The border cartels are merely fulfilling supply where there is demand. And demand remains strong for one key reason: undocumented workers can be easily exploited. Without legal protections, employers can and continue to underpay migrant workers while threatening to report them if they complain about conditions or attempt to go against them. These weaknesses will persist until the U.S. addresses the basic urges to exploit the vulnerable among us. Any society has elements that seek to maximize self-benefit, regardless of harm. And this is the ethical line the cartels have crossed. With rapid increase in demand for cheap, easily discarded labor, they have built a system of inhuman brutality, taking away migrant dignity for profits. The migrants represent human souls reduced to shipping cargo. loaded in boxes bound for U.S. businesses. Of course, the cartels could not operate without making their hands dirty along the way. Corruption remains widespread among Mexican authorities, paid to look the other way, as migrants are trafficked to the border. The cartels could not cross through Central America without officials on the take permitting their movement. Again, the cycle persists because the cartels meet an existing demand. In this case, bribery income for underpaid law enforcement. As Mexican leadership attacks the cruelty, lower-ranking officials continue enabling it, demonstrating how corruption goes into moral actors gradually compromised by circumstances. And the circumstances promoting illegal immigration have many sides to it. Gang violence increases daily as cartels compete for new drug corridors to America, leaving citizens terrorized. Well-intentioned U.S. foreign policy has resulted in unplanned disruption, adding further displacement of people. In this complex area, declaring the border issue black and white becomes impossible. There are only shifting shades of gray, good and bad impulses competing across human nature. The migrants themselves risk all for a shot at a better life, consumed by a vision of American prosperity. This vision has been nurtured through decades of U.S. cultural dominance, movies and media depicting life in the shining city on a hill. The lure remains strong in poorer rural regions, though the contemporary reality is complex. Still, hope persists of streets paved in gold, rooted in visions of American exceptionalism. And this broader context is key to understanding the pain behind border crossings. When your family faces violence and poverty with no opportunity, the risk seems called for, whatever the cost. Especially when ruthless cartel marketing hangs the everlasting dream that just over the border lies a good life. And so, the cycle continues as U.S. policy miscalculates the shifts in global migration. As instability rises in Central America and beyond, official channels for legal migration remain stuck in delays. So, the cartels gladly step into the breach, seizing the opportunity for exploitation. With profits to be made, their persuasion machine runs strong. The promises of America retained in pop culture propel enough motivation. And with rocks and desert at their back, the desperate see only one path forward, though it leads into darkness. This polarity has come to define the immigration debate, which candidates purposely exploit to inflame passions and cultivate loyalty. They frame stark choices pitting morality against security, all for political benefit. In this day and age, the voice of reason struggles to be heard. Those who seek context and compassion become casualties, voices drowned out by the loud and angry. An issue with so many interdependent variables defies such reductive orthodoxy. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is how rapidly the soul can normalize these acts of cruelty when it's protected from its impacts. The comforts allowing such indifference rely on the suppression of unpleasant realities. Out of sight, out of mind, and out of moral conscience, the cartels engage in horrific violence, including beheadings, torture, and dismemberment, to terrorize and intimidate rivals, as well as civilians. They have killed thousands of people in Mexico. They forcibly recruit young teens into their ranks, exposing them to extreme violence and exploitation. Children have been trafficked by cartels as hitmen, lookouts, and drug mules. Cartels systematically kidnap, extort, and threaten business owners, farmers, and everyday citizens. Failure to comply with their demands often results in the murder of the victims and their families. They ambush and kill police officers, journalists, and public officials who speak out against them. The cartels use violence and corruption to undermine democratic institutions. Weapons and drug trafficking by cartels destabilize societies on both sides of the border. Powerful assault rifles and military-grade armaments give cartels overwhelming firepower against Mexican authorities. The huge profits from drug sales allow cartels to bribe public officials up to the highest levels. This corrupts and weakens Mexico's government institutions and the rule of law. Cartels make billions producing and distributing dangerous illegal drugs like meth, heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine, which destroys lives and communities in the US and Mexico. Cartel associates have filled the Montana province with fentanyl and meth, and also opened up their businesses on Indian reservations that are known for low law enforcement security. On the evening of March 17, 2020, a former Mexican police officer working for the cartel left his hotel room in Tijuana and walked across the US border into Southern California at 10:09 at night. Ricardo Ramos Medina's first stop was San Diego International Airport, where he found a tourist car he rented out. He went somewhere close, and he had the privilege of meeting a lady who delivered drugs in the name of a supermarket sack that had methamphetamine inside. Compared to that, he had been traveling for 20 minutes only, and then he started a much longer trip, a 16-hour drive to Montana. Medina had been to the trip a number of times on different occasions. However, in this visit, it didn't work as previous ones. Before he reached his destination, there had been an unlawful seizure inflicted upon him by the state and federal agents. Inside his white Jeep, they found about 2 pounds of pure methamphetamine, enough, authorities said, to supply the entire town of Townsend, Montana. The bust in the course of which the arrest took place is a case of the drug trafficking ring, whose victims are at least 2,000 pounds of methamphetamine and 700,000 pills containing fentanyl, and sent to Pennsylvania from Mexico in 3 seasons. The result was all about money. In such dirty trade like this, a drug dealer could have made so much more profit in Montana than in any other place. Throughout the years, Mexico has been the primary substance trafficking conduit into more isolated US areas. However, due to the fentanyl onslaught, these cartel affiliates have been brutal closer to the borders in Montana, where pills can be sold for about 20 times their original price in the city centers. Officials in the law enforcement sector confirmed. Some parts of the state have literally been steeped in drugs. Annoyingly, tribal chiefs have increasingly expressed their worries about a scourge of crime and overdose epidemic. Certain reservations have witnessed cartel partners getting involved with Native women into romantic and marital relationships, with each one looking to infiltrate and entrench themselves within those communities for selling the drugs, confirmed tribal authorities and law enforcement officers. Dealers from cartels are slowly bringing in even some Native Americans into their business by using them as teenage experimenters, and they turn them into addicts who then end up in debt to the traffickers. The Mexican cartels have also created a climate of fear through their extreme violence and intimidation tactics. Their criminal enterprises undermine security, governance, and the legitimate economy in Mexico, and threaten public health and safety in the United States. stable planet will only accelerate. Borders that once stood tight now appear as open gateways, requiring vision beyond the statuses of migrants and citizens. Perhaps recognizing shared struggles can provide the foundation to move forward. Though progress seems unlikely when expression grows to become a huge conflict, by taking out difficult positions, we sacrifice measured discourse and the chance to discover common ground. Yet when minds stay closed, the suffering continues the same as before, though it's now met with indifference justified through the cover comforts of rage. This cold reality awaits the migrant mother, cradling her child as they surrender to the Border Patrol. In the eyes behind each face lies a story, a narrative we'll never know. And without meaning, they fade anonymously as numbers while the great political wheel churns on. For lives dependent on the compassion of strangers, this completes their misery. But amongst the detachment, they cling to hope, as hope remains last to die. Through this repeated cycle, the border has become a community that has divided America at odds with itself. As the nation struggles to define identity, so does the borderland, severed and reconstituted as beliefs ebb and flow. The migrants are swept up in historical currents, far outpacing them as generations clash over ideology and demographics. Their fates now hinge on the swings of domestic politics, faith placed in leaders who prefer money and profits over stability. And the cartels seize this chance, exploiting the absence of a steady purpose that might impede their profiteering. For them, disruption equals dollars, as both sides become captive to short-term interests. Here at the border, perhaps more than anywhere, sharp commonalities are laid open, showing the world that the loss of humanity binds us more than divides us. But what future gestures for a nation incapable of declaring this self-evident revelation, without which there can be no lasting union? The border was created by human divisions, but understanding can overcome the lines falsely dividing us from fellow people seeking better lives like any of us. Progress depends on reawakening conscience and social responsibility. By valuing humanity over status, we build the foundations to move forward. The border crisis lays America's choices bare. Will we accept hard truths and social responsibility, or retreat deeper into ignorance and fear of the other? Looking ahead, the way forwards is for continuous and intense confrontation between U.S. border security interests and the troubling activities of Mexican cartels. Too much money is at stake for either side to back down or give in. Though progress has been made, the border clearly remains vulnerable to continued exploitation. Therefore, American politicians and policymakers will keep pushing for more barriers, agents, sensors, and other tools to lock the border down. Efforts will also continue targeting cartel leaders, even if the elimination of entire cartels proves impossible. Nevertheless, persistent pressure can constrict the freedom of operation currently enjoyed by the cartels. Yet, the Mexican cartels have also proven highly flexible and adaptive to enforcement crackdowns. They will continue evolving trafficking tactics, routes, and creative ventures to bypass strengthened American defenses. Areas with softer maritime borders will become increasingly utilized as overland crossing gets harder. This game of cat and mouse seems likely to intensify in the years ahead. Ultimately, the border region promises to remain a central battleground between the interests of U.S. law enforcement and the Mexican cartels. Control and exploitation of the border are simply too important for the ambitions of either side. Small victories may be achieved, but permanent resolution is impossible, given the fundamental clash in objectives. While heightened security has clearly damaged the cross-border enterprises of Mexican cartels, it certainly hasn't defeated them. Cartels remain resourceful, flexible, and enthused by spectacular profits. So long as strong illicit demand exists within the United States, the cartels will find ways to service such markets, however risky and problematic. Therefore, the U.S.-Mexico border promises to retain its outsized prominence in the North American illegal drug trade. and residents on both sides of the divide will continue experiencing the traumatic impacts of cartel violence raging around this politically contentious boundary. Neither the cartels nor American authorities seem likely to offer the other any respite or accommodation. So, for the foreseeable future, relations along the US-Mexico border seem destined to remain tense and aggressive. The future in taking down on all cartel activities will prove gradual and uneven. Thus, border security buildups will continue even as cartel resistance and adaptability persist. This stretched-out struggle may produce short-term wins, but promises even greater frustration and dysfunction if more collaborative and holistic policies are not adopted. With billions in trafficking dollars at stake, the ruthless cartels seem unafraid to threaten or attack anyone perceived as a threat, wielding unchecked power across Mexico's lawless border regions. Their reign continues unchallenged. For now, this is footage of Texas troops just before dawn on October 9, 2023. Few of these soldiers had ever carried out similar missions in the past, and in fact, this one mission was called a first-of-a-kind operation. Governor Greg Abbott wanted them to conquer Fronton, aka Cartel Island. The order was simple: retake Fronton Island by force and hold it, come what may. The troops' captain gave them a pep talk.
Let's keep a close eye on those structures that are up there that have that height advantage on us. We have not seen people in there yet, but we know that that's what they're used for.
Indeed, cartels are used to war and much worse. Many of their enemies suffer fates worse than death. Abbott knew when he was sending his troops to do his bidding, this could have ended badly. But wait, why did Texas do this in the first place? Why is this island called Cartel Island? And what does this mean for the ever worse war on drugs and the current situation at the US-Mexico border? Let's dive in. Fronton Island, a place lost between two nations, the US and Mexico, forgotten by both. For years, it was a no-man's land, a 170-acre island formed when the Rio Grande cut a new path. This island, nestled between two river channels, became a haven for cartels. The Gulf Cartel and Cartel del Noreste used it as a strategic point for smuggling drugs, weapons, and people. The cartels reigned supreme here, not because of their strength, but because of a unique legal loophole. Both countries avoided the island due to the unclear ownership and international boundary disputes. Former Border Patrol agent Mike Salinas said,
I don't know what Mexico claims. I don't know if they're claiming ownership of that property. As far as the state, it's always been in question. And as far as the Border Patrol is concerned, with my experience there, it was always a, let's not get on there and find out.
It wasn't until 1976 that the US claimed it under the terms of the Boundary Treaty of 1970, but by then, it was too late. The cartels had already marked their territory. According to local, state, and federal law enforcement officials, the two extraordinarily murderous rival cartels that control or fight for Fronton Island reigned over this part of South, partly because the US and Mexico forgot long ago which one owns it. The cartels exploited the island's dense foliage and strategic location. They used it as a lookout point, storage for illegal goods, and a crossing point for their illicit activities. The Gulf Cartel and CDN even fought over the island, each wanting to control its valuable real estate. This rivalry often turned violent, with shootouts and killings becoming a regular occurrence. Sometimes, lifeless bodies decorated once natural forest paths and abandoned alleyways. It was the stuff of nightmares. The situation escalated in recent years as the cartels grew bolder. They didn't just smuggle drugs, they established their own zones of control. They even built structures and marked them with their cartel symbols. The island became a war zone, with the cartels openly engaging law enforcement officers. In 2016, cartel gunmen fired at Texas Department of Public Safety agents, wounding one. In 2019, a Border Patrol boat was riddled with bullets. Local residents lived in fear. Indeed, there were still innocent people living in this place, and now they could no longer call this place home. But they had nowhere else to go. The once peaceful village of Fronton became a battleground. People avoided certain areas, knowing they were cartel territories.
This 80-year-old lifelong Fronton resident, whose fence had just been torn open by a on a trafficker who crashed into it during a police chase, said he hasn't gone near his river neighbor's property 200 yards away in 30 years.
Imagine living in constant fear like that. This is basically life during wartime, but the cartels don't care. If they did, so many people in Central and South America would be alive and safe today. Fronton Island's strategic location made it a perfect spot for cartel operations, and they were determined to keep it. By 2021, the situation at Fronton Island had reached a boiling point. The cartel's activities became more brazen and their control over the island more entrenched. The Texas government, led by Governor Greg Abbott, decided it was time to take action. Operation Lone Star was launched to combat illegal immigration and drug trafficking at the border. Operation Lone Star was a massive effort involving multiple state agencies and thousands of National Guard soldiers. The aim was to deter illegal activities along the border by increasing patrols and fortifying vulnerable areas. However, the cartels were not easily deterred. They continued their operations, using the island as a safe haven, or rather, a cash machine. You see, this island was so profitable, you could smuggle narcotics, weapons, and people back and forth over the border. Plus, as the troop's captain said, cartels are used to being at constant war. On top of smuggling, kidnapping, and money laundering, cartels tend to be good at killing. They have to constantly eliminate rivals, such as other cartels or law enforcement agents, to keep carrying on their illicit businesses. So yeah, in the eyes of Texan authorities, there was no other way around this. In October 2023, the Texas Rangers received intelligence about cartel activity on Fronton Island. Surveillance footage showed armed cartel members patrolling the island. The decision was made to launch a raid and take control of the island. This mission was risky, but necessary to reclaim the island from the cartels. And Victor Escalon, the regional director for Texas's Department for Public Safety, said that so many Texan troops had been deployed elsewhere to take care of the immigrant crisis. So now, Fronton Island was even more at risk.
Federal government, they're not able to cover all these areas and provide the safety, the security for landowners that are in Texas. This is the answer, and I call it being proactive.
On the morning of October 9th, heavily armed Texas Rangers, supported by National Guard units, began their mission. They moved in with military precision, prepared for a fierce battle. The cartels were known for their firepower and willingness to engage law enforcement. The Rangers were aware of the risks, but were determined to succeed. During the pre-mission briefing, a Texas Rangers captain warned the assembled troops about the potential for stray rounds from cartel infighting across the border.
When those guys engage, we have a lot of bullets fly our way. It's not directed fire, so just be aware of that. If they start firing on someone over there, you'll kind of just want to take some cover. Bullets have definitely flown over our heads.
The captain went on to emphasize the need for careful target identification should the troops come under direct fire while seizing the island. Accidentally killing a Mexican soldier could spark an international incident or even lead to extradition and prosecution in Mexico. However, he made clear that deliberate attacks by cartel members, especially those fleeing a gunfight, would be met with overwhelming force. Almost as an afterthought, he warned of aggressive Africanized bees on the island. That's just to give some context on how brutal and dangerous such a mission really is. Not to say you're wearing layers of military equipment in a scorching climate.
Let's keep a close eye on those structures that are up there that have that height advantage on us. We have not seen people in there yet, but we know that that's what they're used for.
The captain mentioned one last thing. Mexican authorities were supposed to have secured the southern part of the island, ensuring cartel sicarios wouldn't come by the hundreds to destroy them. However, cartels have thrived for decades because of corruption in Mexico, so the troops should keep an eye out and almost raid the island as if they had no helping hand. As the sun rose, casting an orange glow, the heavily armed contingent, including elite military personnel who shunned photographs, mounted up into a roaring convoy of ATVs and launched their invasion of Fronton Island. Police drones buzzed ahead, scouting the dense brush for hidden threats. The troops plowed through muddy terrain, a rare rain having soaked the ground overnight. Drenched in sweat from the humidity and the weight of body armor, the officers felt the pressure as they tried to get familiar with this new environment. For many, this alien landscape could become their station post for months or years to come. a duty with no certain end in sight. Bullet-pock structures across the river bore the marks of Gulf Cartel territory, a looming reminder of the high stakes at play. For all involved, this island interdiction represented far more than a single mission. It signaled a grim new phase in an intractable border conflict, one where the lines between domestic law enforcement and international warfare grow ever more blurred.
Here, a large barn-like warehouse just across from the island bears the Cartel del Noreste ownership signature, CDN.
The raid was meticulously planned. Drones provided real-time surveillance, scouting for cartel personnel and potential traps. Mexican law enforcement was also involved, setting up a security zone on their side of the border. And indeed, they held their end of the deal. As the Rangers moved in, they encountered abandoned cartel structures. These buildings, marked with cartel symbols, were strategically placed on the island's high points. They were used as lookout posts and sniper nests. The Rangers secured the buildings, ensuring no traps were left behind. The raid was a success. No cartel members were found, and the island was secured without any casualties. The Texas Rangers planted the Lone Star flag, marking the island as reclaimed territory. However, the real challenge was just beginning. Taking control of Fronton Island was only the first step. The Texas government needed to fortify and secure the island to prevent the cartels from reclaiming it. The dense vegetation that provided cover for cartel activities had to be cleared. This would make it easier to monitor the island and prevent any illicit activities.
And what's the idea behind clearing all the brush?
To have more visibility. We're lower than Mexico, so obviously we're at a disadvantage. So we want to clear the brush. That we have a more tactical advantage against them.
The Texas National Guard and the Department of Public Safety began the arduous task of clearing the island. Over 1.5 miles of razor wire was laid down, and heavy equipment was brought in to strip the island of its foliage. This operation was not without controversy. Environmentalists raised concerns about the impact on local wildlife and the potential for erosion. However, the Texas government prioritized security, the security of humans, over environmental concerns. Clearing the vegetation was a tactical move. It provided better visibility and reduced the cartel's ability to use the island for cover. Regular patrols were established to maintain control and prevent any attempts by the cartels to retake the island. This was a long-term commitment, requiring resources and manpower. Despite the success of the initial raid, the cartels did not give up easily. Surveillance footage captured cartel members patrolling the border area near the island. The fight was far from over. The Texas government knew they had to remain vigilant and continue their efforts to secure the border. The raid on Fronton Island was a significant step in Operation Lone Star. It demonstrated the Texas government's commitment to combating cartel activities and securing the border. However, the cartels were resilient, and their operations continued elsewhere along the border. The battle was ongoing, and the Texas Rangers and National Guard had to remain alert. In February 2024, Greg Abbott announced that Texan troops began working on an 80-acre military facility to provide around 18,000 soldiers to defend the southern border from illegal migrants. It was also reported that Texas troops had discovered explosive devices and weapons on Fronton Island, as well as a massive amount of drugs that could kill every man, woman, or child a couple of times over. Since its seizure, the Texas DPS and military soldiers put concertina wire that has similarly been placed in high-volume migrant areas like Shelby Park. Texas Land Commissioner Dawn Buckingham said,
"I can tell you, there are no more weapons caches and people coming across the border."
The raid on Fronton Island was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader strategy to combat the influence of cartels along the US-Mexico border. The cartels had grown powerful over the years, exploiting the border's vulnerabilities to smuggle drugs, weapons, and people into the United States. Their activities fueled violence and crime, both in Mexico and the US. The war on drugs in Mexico had been ongoing since 2006, when the Mexican government declared war on the cartels. Ironically, this conflict led to widespread violence and corruption. The cartels infiltrated various levels of government, making it difficult to combat their influence. The US also faced challenges, with an insatiable demand for narcotics driving the cartel's operations. The raid on Fronton Island highlighted the complexity of the border crisis. It was not just about drug trafficking. It involved illegal immigration, human trafficking, and gun smuggling. The cartels exploited the chaos, using it to their advantage. The Texas government's efforts were a step in the right direction, but the problem was far from resolved. Victor Escalon said about raiding Cartel Island,
"This is a lifelong mission, a lifelong operation. It never ends. They're going to move, and if they move somewhere else, we'll identify it and just follow them everywhere up and down the river. The way we look at this is forever."
Operation Lone Star aimed to address these issues by increasing security and patrols along the border. The Texas Rangers and National Guard played a crucial role in these efforts, but they faced significant challenges. The vast border area, difficult terrain, and limited resources made it a daunting task. Despite these obstacles, they continued their mission, determined to make a difference. The success of the raid on Fronton Island was a morale boost for the Texas Rangers and National Guard. It showed that with determination and strategic planning, they could disrupt the cartel's operations. However, they knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. For other people, the outlook is even more pessimistic.
All it's going to do is do away with an island. I think they can still move whatever commodity they want to get north or south. It's going to be a speed bump for them.
As Mike said, cartels have all the resources they need: money, time, paramilitary equipment, and a propensity for violence and brutality that no soldier on the good side of the law can match. So in his opinion, it is just a matter of time before they reclaim the island. And if they don't, they'll find other territories to seize and use for their profits. The US-Mexico border has long been a focal point for complex issues surrounding immigration, drug trafficking, and organized crime. In recent years, the situation has escalated into a full-blown humanitarian crisis, with millions of lives impacted on both sides of the border. At the heart of the crisis is the powerful grip of Mexican drug cartels, particularly in border states like Tamaulipas, Chihuahua, and Sinaloa. These criminal organizations have built multi-billion-dollar empires through the trafficking of drugs like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into the U.S.
According to the CDC, fentanyl was the leading cause for the record number of drug poisonings and overdose deaths in America last year.
The illicit drug trade has fueled an epidemic of addiction, overdoses, and drug-related deaths across America. In 2021 alone, over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, with a significant portion of those deaths linked to potent synthetic opioids like fentanyl smuggled across the southern border.
What drugs did they take? What drugs?
The human toll of the cartel's operations extends far beyond just drug users. The groups employ brutal violence and intimidation to protect their territories and supply lines. Journalists, activists, politicians, and civilians who speak out against them often end up disappeared or murdered in grisly fashion. Entire towns along trafficking routes live in a constant state of fear. The cartel's reach extends deep into Mexican law enforcement and government institutions through widespread bribery and corruption, allowing them to operate with near impunity. This lawlessness and violence is a major driver of migration, as countless Mexican and Central American families flee north to escape cartel persecution and recruitment. Human smugglers, known as coyotes, often with links to the cartels, exploit these desperate migrants, extorting huge sums to transport them on perilous journeys to the U.S. border. Many endure horrific abuses, assaults, and deprivations along the way, only to arrive facing an overwhelmed U.S. immigration system ill-equipped to handle the surge. In fiscal year 2022, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol reported over 2.3 million encounters with migrants at the southern border, an all-time record. Overcrowded processing centers and shelters force many to wait in squalid, dangerous conditions, while an enormous case backlog means those seeking asylum often wait years for a hearing. Controversial policies like Title 42, which allows for immediate expulsions due to public health concerns, have further increased repeat crossing attempts. Because the routes are controlled by cartels, migrants are frequently used as unwilling mules to smuggle drugs in exchange for passage. This dynamic puts U.S. border agents in extremely difficult positions as they attempt to balance the roles of humanitarianism and law enforcement under strained conditions. criminal organizations like the Gulf Cartel and Cartel del Noreste control territory right up to the border's edge, using vulnerable migrants as pawns and attacking U.S. personnel with near impunity from the Mexican side. Tragically, fiscal year 2022 also saw a record number of migrant deaths, with 853 people perishing trying to cross into the U.S., and that figure likely a dramatic undercount. The convergence of cartel violence, drug smuggling, and mass migration has transformed the U.S.-Mexico border into a powder keg, sowing division and acrimony in both countries' domestic politics. While the complexity of the issues defies easy soundbites or solutions, what's clear is the status quo is untenable and extracting a devastating human cost. Effectively addressing the emergency will likely require major domestic and foreign policy shifts, potentially including overhauling the legal immigration system to expand avenues for those fleeing persecution, surging resources for drug addiction treatment, cracking down on weapons trafficking into Mexico, stepping up anti-corruption campaigns, and most crucially, targeting cartel finances to undermine their power. None of this will be easy, fast, or politically popular, but the alternative is more of the grim same. A border that acts as an open wound between neighbors, one where the suffering and exploitation of the vulnerable has become a cruel new normal. The Texas government needed to remain vigilant and continue their efforts to secure the border. Cartels are destroying lives in every way imaginable, and it might seem impossible to end their terrible wars. But perhaps there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The key to success lies in continued cooperation between state and federal agencies, as well as with Mexican authorities. Joint operations and intelligence sharing could help disrupt cartel activities more effectively. The use of technology is also crucial. Drones, surveillance cameras, and other advanced tools provide real-time intelligence and improved border security. These technologies could help monitor remote areas and identify potential threats before they escalate. Public support and awareness are equally important. The people of Texas, especially those living near the border, needed to understand the significance of these operations. Community involvement and reporting suspicious activities could aid law enforcement efforts. The Texas government also needed to address the root causes of the border crisis. Economic instability, violence, and corruption in Mexico drove many to seek a better life in the U.S. Addressing these issues requires a comprehensive approach involving economic aid, education, and anti-corruption measures. While this is a long-term goal, it is necessary for sustainable peace and security. The raid on Fronton Island was a bold and necessary move in the fight against the cartels. However, the battle is far from over, and continued efforts are needed to secure the border and protect the people of Texas. The road ahead is challenging, but with perseverance and strategic planning, victory, and most importantly, peace is within reach.
Si metes la cabeza donde no te llaman, se te mocha la cabeza.
My God, they have guns. Jesus, go.
Listen, we all know Mexico's drug cartels can be especially cruel when dealing with anyone who stands in their way, but let me ask you this. When you think of cartels, what do you think is their weapon of choice? I'm betting you're probably thinking of something along the lines of knives or guns. So what if I told you that they're now using drones to launch their vicious attacks?
¿Un dron o qué?
That's right. Long gone are the days when cartel members would stick to ground violence. They've been keeping up with technological advancements just as much as the rest of the world. And why wouldn't they? Not only that, but they're also using the very same drones for surveillance purposes, which is some pretty terrifying news when you think about it. Who would have thought that the age-old game of cat and mouse would get such a high-tech twist? Get ready to dive into one crazy story, full of twists and turns, and let's find out what the US is doing about all this. Recently, there has been a surge in the use of drones by Mexican cartels to monitor US Border Patrol activities. And these aren't just hobby drones buzzing about. We're talking about sophisticated, high-end gadgets used to scout and gather intelligence in real time. Imagine this. Thousands of drone attacks are being reported every single month. They're infiltrating US airspace to keep tabs on Border Patrol movements. The number of such incidents has been so shocking that it even prompted officials to discuss it during the Senate Arms Committee back in May.
The number of incursions was something that was alarming to me. I don't know the actual number. I don't think anybody does, but it's in the thousands. I would say in the probably over a month.
So, what's the deal with these cartels and their high-tech espionage? Well, they are using drones to navigate the dense border terrain. They need to identify any weak surveillance spots that they might be able to take advantage of in the future. This will allow them to orchestrate their trafficking operations with surgical precision. It's like a game of chess, really, but with drones as pawns and billions of dollars at stake.
They know it's an extra tool that they can use so they can continue to bring their drugs across.
Cartels aren't new to adopting advanced technology. For them, this is a matter of survival and expansion. By utilizing drones, they can outmaneuver law enforcement, making it increasingly challenging for authorities to stem the flow of drugs and human trafficking. The border between the US and Mexico is about 2,000 miles long. It's one of the longest in the world, and it's a hot zone where cartels like the Sinaloa and the CJNG are fiercely dueling for absolute control. These organizations capitalize on areas that are lacking in surveillance to smuggle narcotics and people, amassing wealth and perpetuating violence in the process. Adam Isaacson, from the Washington office on Latin America, stresses that power vacuums within the cartels have only added more chaos on top of the already dire situation along the US-Mexican border.
Hay inestabilidad causada por la salida del Chapo Guzmán, la salida de la extradición de uno de los hijos del Chapo Guzmán, más divisiones dentro del cartel de Sinaloa, más competencia por las rutas especialmente del fentanyl.
As factions within the Sinaloa cartel compete for control, violence then escalates, so regions along both sides of the border become increasingly more dangerous. But when you think about it, this all ties back to what we've seen over the past few decades. Cartels evolving from simple trafficking gangs into complex crime syndicates who are becoming masters of advanced technology as time goes on. That being said, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border have no choice but to always upgrade their surveillance and intelligence gathering techniques in order to counteract these sophisticated criminals.
They have all this money, all of this power, this increase in size operationally. I would say that these drones do become a national security problem.
But why are these drone incursions such a big deal? Beyond the immediate fear of drugs and illegal immigrants crossing the border, these drones can give cartels real-time intelligence on US patrol locations, shifts, and blind spots. It effectively places the US Border Patrol in a constant state of reaction, always a step behind their adversaries.
What the cartels have proven time and time again is that they will do mostly anything for money.
As this high-tech cat-and-mouse game unfolds, it's clear that maintaining an edge over these cartels requires innovative strategies and enhanced cooperation between Mexican and US authorities. Coordinated efforts and shared intelligence could make it harder for cartels to exploit technological gaps. But as we understand the magnitude of this new approach by the cartels, it leads us to wonder, what are the broader implications of these flying spies? How have drones revolutionized the game for these cartels? We've established that cartels are using drones to monitor US border patrols. But this raises a bigger question. How did we get here? How did drones evolve from being cool gadgets you'd see at a park to becoming sophisticated tools of terror deployed by organized crime? The first recorded instance of a weaponized drone in Mexico dates all the way back to 2017, when Mexican federal police stopped a car loaded with guns and what was described as a bazooka bomber drone. This drone was packed with explosives ready to dive bomb its targets. Early attempts like this were simple and didn't require much know-how, but they were the ones that set the stage for what was to come. Fast forward to 2021, and the cartels have seriously upped their game. The CJNG cartel, which is pretty well known for its advanced paramilitary techniques right now, was already using weaponized drones to attack police forces.
¿Un dron o qué? Ese mero. ¿Dónde está el dron? Está volando.
And these drones were no longer experimental. They had become essential tools in the cartel's arsenals. Reports from various security journals, as well as the CJNG themselves, summarize how these drones have a significant psychological impact, sowing fear among rival cartels, law enforcement, and even innocent civilians.
This is modern warfare. We use war technologies. We use drones. Here, everybody is adequately trained to use them to the maximum so that they can hear that thunder.
One particularly horrifying account comes from Guerrero, a state in Mexico that has become a testing ground for drone warfare.
The Jalisco New Generation Cartel has created a specialized elite drone unit where these members of the cartel are being trained to turn commercial drones into flying bombs to attack rivals and Mexican authorities.
The CJNG specifically targeted homes, schools, and even churches using drones equipped with high explosive munitions, and the exact number of people who lost their lives that day is still unknown. And wait until you hear about who has been allegedly training these guys to operate these drones.
A cartel source telling the Daily Beast that an American man actually trained those cartel members on how to source, fly, and use these commercial drones and turn them into bombs.
You heard that right. Someone from within the US has been purposefully giving out some pretty valuable information to the cartels to aid them in committing these crimes. But why drones? Well, it's tricky. For one, drones are relatively cheap compared to other forms of military tech. You can buy a high-end commercial drone for just a few $1,000s, strap on some homemade explosives, and you've got a flying weapon that can be controlled remotely. Moreover, drones provide a degree of anonymity and distance for the operator, therefore reducing the risk of immediate retaliation. And, as we've previously established, you can't really ignore the shock value that these weapons tend to have. It's psychological warfare at its most brutal.
Es una manera pues de atacar a su enemigo con las bombas pues, de los bancos.
¿Tú lo viste los drones? Cuando lo van armando y lo van poniendo. ¿Cómo lo viste y cómo están?
Están grandes, son drones grandes.
And it's not just about dropping bombs. Many cartels are exploring drones' potential for surveillance. This capability comes in handy for various illicit operations, such as scouting new trafficking routes or keeping an eye on rival gangs and police activities. Drones can fly high above, capturing real-time data and transmitting it back to operators who can make quick, informed decisions. As these drones crisscross Mexican skies, trafficking narcotics isn't the only concern. They also pose risks to U.S. national security.
Flying in the skies over the Rio Grande Valley. 10,000 cartel drone incursions and 25,000 drone sightings were recorded last year in the sector alone. Scouts watching every move being made on the U.S. side.
These drones aren't just a nuisance. They gather crucial intelligence on U.S. Border Patrol activities, further complicating an already challenging task.
The adversaries have 17 times the number of drones, twice the amount of flight hours, and unlimited funding to grow their operations.
So, what's being done to counter this airborne menace? Well, Border Patrol agents and even the Mexican government have been ramping up their anti-drone measures. This includes equipping forces with technology to intercept or disable these drones mid-flight. One of the most powerful tools in this fight against drones is this airborne device called the Tethered Aerostat Radar System.
We fly as close to 24/365 as we can. Our law enforcement operators that see that on the radar will then engage and get the drugs, get the bad guys that are waiting for the drugs.
There are also ongoing discussions about increasing penalties for those caught using drones for criminal activities, as well as using technologies meant to bring down these drones.
Mexican president is also going to be equipping the Mexican army with anti-drone technology.
So now that we've seen the sky's dangerous turn, let's now ground ourselves by examining the broader crisis at the US-Mexico border, where these high-tech tools are just one part of a much larger and more complex puzzle. The US-Mexico border is more than just a geographical frontier. It's a hotspot where things like drug trafficking, human smuggling, and organized crime collide violently. Imagine you're cruising down a sunlit highway, enjoying the open road. Suddenly, your joyful drive comes to an abrupt halt as a group of heavily armed men steps onto the street, and they're not law enforcement or the military. This isn't a scene from an action-packed gangster movie. It's an everyday occurrence in regions dominated by cartels.
Ajá.
Guárdame el teléfono, por favor, porque no te lo quiero quitar.
Ok.
Guárdamelo.
Oh, no, que tenemos el mapa nomás.
Bueno, hijo, hay que ponerle $1000 aquí para la mañana, 500 y 500 para que se me vayan bien.
These encounters can range from benign to straight up terrifying.
Oh my God, they have guns. Jesus.
Go.
No.
These checkposts are run by ruthless cartels like Sinaloa and the CJNG. One of the most alarming facts about the current border crisis is how deeply involved these cartels really are. They've essentially set up shadow governments, setting their own taxes, enforcing their own laws through violence, and challenging the state's control. Businesses operating in these areas are subject to relentless extortion. Residents live in constant fear, and corruption seeps through the very fabric of law enforcement and politics.
There's no security here, no peace, no tranquility. There's only fear, crying and fear.
The presence of cartels stifles economic opportunities. Beautiful, historic parts of Mexico become ghost towns as word spreads about the dangers of traveling through cartel territory. Tourists stay away, businesses suffer, and entire communities face economic ruin. The grip of fear is palpable, reaching far beyond the immediate threat of violence. The Mexican government's efforts to combat these criminal syndicates have included deploying thousands of military and federal police officers along the border. Adding to the chaos, the cartel's advanced tactics create a cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement. For instance, new groups like CJNG came into the picture, and they even more brutal than their predecessors.
Si metes la cabeza donde no te llaman, se te mocha la cabeza.
These groups weren't just dealing drugs, they were engaged in an ongoing struggle for dominance, marked by brutal displays of power and control. Gruesome displays of power by the cartels are not uncommon.
They are finding heads in public parks, arms and legs in trash bags, bodies wrapped in blankets outside their homes.
This calculated use of terror is meant to maintain control and keep communities in line.
We're afraid of getting in a car, getting in a taxi, walking in the street alone.
And to make matters even worse, the CJNG has since started using innovative war tactics, including these dreadful drones, to make sure that no one stands in their way, which brings us to the current US-Mexico border crisis.
We have to beef up our intel. We have to beef up understanding and knowing where these drones are coming from, when they're going to come, where they're going to land.
Whatever your stance on the US-Mexico border crisis is, one thing's crystal clear. The only constant in these cartel-controlled areas is violence. It's so bad that many feel their only option is to flee, risking capture by US Border Patrol officers, because anything is better than the hell they face back home.
Daniel made the 5,000-kilometer trip with his 2 young cousins to escape gang violence and poverty back home.
There's one reason, and one reason only, for the ongoing crisis, and that's profit. We're talking about billions of dollars at stake here, and cartels are more than happy to reach out and grab as much as they can. And the fentanyl crisis that's currently gripping the United States is a testament to this. The quest for higher profits has led cartels to produce fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 70 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. It's cheap and easy to produce, and the smallest amount can always be lethal.
If you don't go after who the problem is, which is these cartels, and crush their labs, you're just seeing the beginning.
This crisis has claimed tens of thousands of lives across every demographic, and judging by the sheer quantities that make their way through the border, this crisis isn't showing any signs of stopping anytime soon.
Americans are now more likely to die from an accidental opioid overdose than in a car crash.
Families are shattered by addiction, healthcare systems are overwhelmed, and the criminal justice system buckling under the pressure of drug-related crimes. The human cost extends far beyond those who overdose. Entire families are ruined. So when you hear their testimonies, it's hard not to find them heart-shattering.
I know he made a mistake. He made a big mistake that cost him his life. I don't want that to happen to anybody else. I'm devastated, I'm heartbroken, I'm shattered.
In the end, people on both sides of the border are suffering as we speak. Regular folks are enduring unimaginable violence and terror, driving them to desperate measures. When it comes to the US-Mexico border, every inch feels like it's rocking on the edge of becoming the next big smuggling route. Think about it, over 2,000 miles of shared border. How do you even begin to lock down that kind of expanse? It's a nightmare scenario with no easy answers. And US officials have proposed a wide range of solutions, ranging from drastic measures, such as former President Donald Trump's initiative to send actual kill squads to tackle the cartel leaders head-on, or Biden's more tame approach of dealing with the root causes of the current fentanyl epidemic in order to slow down the unhindered demand for the drug. Sadly, however, Actual progress has been slow, and cartels are still carrying out these operations as we speak, so let's dig deeper into these plans and see what their possible outcome might look like. We all know that President Donald Trump has always been pretty vocal as far as the US-Mexico border crisis is concerned. For Trump, the cartels were more than just a problem. They were a direct threat to US national security. He didn't shy away from highlighting the opioid crisis either.
Lethal drugs are pouring across our wide-open border, stealing hundreds of thousands of beautiful American lives, and it's happening like never before in our history.
And his grand plan? It's labeling the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. That's right, he wanted to give them the same status as groups like ISIS. The goal? To take more aggressive actions against them. He boasted that his administration had significantly reduced drug trafficking through new border barriers and increased patrols, but critics didn't seem too convinced, saying the drugs and violence kept flowing regardless. But here's where it really gets wild. Trump allegedly floated the idea of sending US military forces straight to Mexico.
You also said recently that if you're reelected, you would send special forces and, quote, other military assets to Mexico to stop the drug cartels.
War on cartels. Mexico's petrified of the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico.
What's more, his defense secretary, Mark Esper, even said he had to pull him back from launching missile attacks on cartel leaders.
I'd say, Mr. President, I understand the motive. I had to explain to him, we can't do that. It would violate international law.
Now, while Trump's approach bordered on the extreme, President Biden's strategy is, let's just say, of a more cautious and collaborative nature. President Biden's administration is focused on a more holistic approach, emphasizing cooperation with Mexico and Central American countries. The idea here is to tackle the root causes of migration and cartel influence, things like promoting economic development, enhancing law enforcement collaboration, and rooting out the ever-present corruption. Remember when a former Mexican top law enforcement agent got busted for helping out the cartels?
Prosecutors called in former members of the cartel to testify against Luna. They claimed he received more than $200 million in bribes.
You heard that right. There's literally hundreds of millions of dollars to be made from being on the side of the cartels, so policymakers are treading one seriously thin line right now. During a press briefing, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre faced tough questions about Biden's stance on cartels operating close to the U.S. Biden has long been accused of not taking much drastic action in dealing with the border crisis.
Why is President Biden so comfortable with cartels operating so close to the U.S.?
Her response? Highly focused on the strides made in seizing fentanyl.
The work that this president has done, specifically on fentanyl at the border, it's at historic lows. On top of that, historic sanctions going after traffickers and other financiers are helping disrupt fentanyl supply.
The logic here is pretty straightforward. If you go after the demand, you will end up cutting off the cartel's primary source of income. But that's easier said than done. Reducing addiction levels in the US is a monumental task, but Biden's team believes it's a critical component in weakening the cartels. Trump versus Biden. It's like comparing fire and water. Trump's approach is all about immediate and brute force. Border walls, military intervention, and maximum pressure on the cartels. Biden, on the other hand, is looking at long-term solutions that address the underlying issues: poverty, corruption, and lack of opportunities that fuel the cartel's power. One thing's for sure, neither strategy is without its challenges. Trump's hardline tactics received criticism for their potential to destabilize diplomatic relations and escalate violence. Biden's approach, while more gentle, faces the tricky task of actual implementation, which takes time and sustained effort. The battle against the cartels is far from over. For now, we watch, we wait, and we hope for a breakthrough that will bring an end to the chaos gripping the border regions. The stakes are high, and the consequences are even higher. Stay tuned, because this roller coaster ride is far from reaching its conclusion.
The most wanted drug lord in the world, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, led away by authorities after 6 months on the run.
Here's the poster just released, El Chapo now caught, but it came after a bloody shootout. And in the end, this is what he looked like, when he was found.
The convicted Sinaloa cartel boss, who was responsible for 80% of Chicago's illegal drug trade, trying to do something that would convince a court he was wronged by U.S. prosecutors.
The internationally infamous cartel leader, El Chapo, has sent out an SOS to Mexico's president. But is there a more sinister meaning to his outcry? And why should the U.S. to Mexico border take note? Known as one of the most notorious, powerful, and richest drug traffickers in recent times, his incredible rags-to-riches story of escaping poverty to become a billionaire criminal kingpin seems almost too unbelievable to be true. El Chapo, whose real name is Joaquin Argibaldo Guzman Loera, was born in 1957 into a poor family in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. As a young boy, El Chapo's beginning involved growing up on a small cannabis farm, growing marijuana crops himself. From this, he had his entry into the criminal world of drugs. However, El Chapo had bigger ambitions than just subsistence farming. In his late teens, he started working for the nearby Guadalajara Cartel, a powerful criminal group involved in drug trafficking and other organized crime activities across the rugged northwestern Mexico territories. El Chapo proved himself to be a smart and quick operator in the cartel. Despite his short 5'6" stature that earned him the nickname meaning Shorty, he also developed a name for himself during this time as El Rapido, speedy, due to the speed at which he worked. He made his way up through the ranks thanks to a ruthless mindset and ability to get things done so quickly. By the late 1980s, El Chapo emerged as the head leader of the fearsome Sinaloa cartel, centered in his home region of Sinaloa, but with operations spreading all the way across Mexico and into the lucrative markets of the United States. Under his control, the Sinaloa cartel became one of the most well-known traffickers of drugs like cocaine, heroin, meth, and cannabis.
6 people are under arrest tonight after U.S. authorities discovered a drug tunnel between San Diego and Tijuana. The tunnel, the length of 6 football fields and 6 stories below ground, has rail tracks, ventilation, and electricity.
El Chapo oversaw the cartel's complex smuggling routes, transporting huge quantities of drugs across the long Mexico-U.S. border through inventive methods. This involved building underground tunnels, hiding product in ordinary vehicles with secret compartments, distributions by plane, boat, you name it. He also cultivated an army of hitmen to protect operations to continue the smooth running. The Sinaloa cartel's territorial wars with rivals grew, which left a trail of horrifying violence and tens of thousands dead. But the billions in profits also allowed El Chapo to indulge in a lavish billionaire's lifestyle, with multiple mansions, private jets, luxury cars, and everything he could imagine, including his infamous diamond-encrusted pistol, which was a huge difference from his poor start in life. However, with so much power also came infamy. El Chapo transformed into Mexico's most wanted fugitive as law enforcement from both Mexico and the United States intensified efforts to capture him. Other cartels were also taking notice and wanted an opportunity at the top. In 1993, the Tijuana cartel were after a chance to knock El Chapo from the top and take control. Following a tip-off that El Chapo was at the Guadalajara International Airport waiting for a flight, the gunmen opened fire on a car they believed El Chapo was hiding in. It was, however, a case of mistaken identity. They had attacked the wrong car. Inside the bullet holes-ridden car was the Archbishop and Cardinal of Guadalajara, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, who was a high-profile religious figure, and with his death came outrage that spread across Mexico. The outrage caused El Chapo's status to change to a wanted man. He was made partly to blame for the Cardinal's murder. Shortly after this, he was captured trying to flee through Guatemala, and he was sent to the Federal Center for Social Rehabilitation No. 2. The sentence thrown at him was 20 years and 9 months. However, he was sure to make his prison time very comfortable. Despite the high security protocols, El Chapo's endless ability to buy off corrupt guards and officials soon became evident. He continued managing the Sinaloa cartel's operations from his cell, thanks to access to cell phones. He was even allowed to have girlfriends, mistresses, his wives, and alcohol snuck inside to keep him comfortable. Puente Grande was essentially just another luxury home for the spoiled boss to run the cartel from. With all the spare time, he was able to create new ways of smuggling and inevitably grow the cartel even stronger. In his comfy cell, with access to everything he needed and wanted, breaking out had never crossed his mind. Until in 2001, when the Mexican Supreme Court ruled for a law to be created which would allow some Mexican prisoners to be extradited to the United States. After El Chapo had heard this, he was no doubt worried, so he began planning his escape as soon as possible. Just days after planning had started, he was ready. And in January 2001, El Chapo put his plan into action. With the correct bribes paid, he was able to escape by simply hiding in a laundry cart and was wheeled out to freedom. After his escape, El Chapo was on the run for over 13 years. During this time, he was able to run his cartel freely. He constantly moved between duplication safe houses and hideouts across Mexico, always one step ahead of the multi-billion-dollar military-led manhunt trying to track him down. He was also looking to gain control over crucial areas in northern Mexico that bordered with the US. The cartels fought over control, and with this, the drug war-related deaths grew hugely each year. And with this, the manhunt heated up. That nationwide manhunt finally achieved a win in 2014 when Mexican Marines successfully captured El Chapo at a beachside resort in Mazatlan following a firefight with his personal armed security team. He was promptly locked away at the federal maximum security prison in Altiplano, considered the most secure detention facility in all of Mexico. At the new prison, the Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, which was highly restricted, his cell had no windows, a single bed with one shower and one toilet. He was not allowed to interact with any other inmates and was only allowed out for an hour a day, a far cry from what he was used to at his previous prison. The maximum security prison featured rigid security protocols like 24/7 camera cover, rotating guard details, full body screenings for visitors, metal detectors, and even sensors in place to detect any attempts at tunneling underneath the complex. No prisoner had ever broken out of this high security prison, until El Chapo, that is.
His arrest last year was heralded worldwide. He has now escaped from prison for a second time. Late last night, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman broke out of a maximum security prison about 60 miles from Mexico City.
In July 2015, El Chapo accomplished his most brazen, unbelievable prison escape yet.
This is the moment Joaquin El Chapo Guzman makes the Mexican government look ridiculous. Pacing up and down in his cell, calmly, waiting. These are the last images of Guzman before he makes the most daring escape in recent history. At one point, he appears to bend forward, focusing on something in the floor of the shower.
Somehow, he had managed to set up the construction of an elaborate mile-long tunnel shaft from a nearby construction site leading directly into the shower area of his isolated cell. On the night of his successful jailbreak, El Chapo simply pried open the entrance to the tunnel within his shower's blind spot, climbed down a ladder, jumped on a waiting motorcycle that was fixed to rails within the shaft, and zipped out to freedom over 30 feet underground before anyone even realized he was gone. The audacity and complexity of the tunnel's construction, complete with ventilation, lighting, and even a motorbike, left Mexican authorities shocked. It became clear El Chapo had to have had help from corrupt officials, engineers, and prison workers to pull off this feat from inside a supposed impenetrable supermax. El Chapo's legendary escape abilities showcased to both American and Mexican governments that no protocol would ever be enough to reliably detain such a crafty, rich man who was able to buy off any accomplices he liked with his extreme wealth and bribery skills. This escape, however, was short-lived compared to his previous time at large, and after only 6 months on the run, he was captured again back where it all started, in Sinaloa. Guzman was at a safe house in the coastal city of Los Mochis, which was under surveillance. That January 2016, a joint operation known as Operation Black Swan, carried out by U.S. Delta Force, U.S. Marshals, Mexican Navy Special Forces, and Mexican Marines took place, and this led to the final capture of El Chapo.
That image of Guzman in handcuffs, sitting on a bed, wearing a dirty shirt. The Mexican president tweeting, "Misión cumplida," mission accomplished, we have him.
So this time, rather built of El Chapo's new underground cage at the ADX Supermax in Colorado enforces a strict system, completely stripping him of all luxury, privacy, contact, and has the ultimate form of psychological restraint upon such a formerly powerful, ingenious criminal mastermind. It's an extreme, torturous environment, crafted specifically to frustrate outliers like El Chapo, who are too resourceful and influential to risk even a slight chance of freedom or ability to try any escape plots ever again. Since his transfer into the ADX Supermax custody, El Chapo has repeatedly protested what he views as inhumane treatment and lack of basic privileges, everything from very limited outdoor activity time, bad prison meals, zero opportunity to make purchases, and barely any human contact, or apart from occasional pre-approved family calls and attorney visits, which are heavily monitored. But U.S. federal prison officials have remained firm in imposing the harshest prison conditions upon El Chapo. His track record for ingeniously planned and complex prison escapes leaves zero margin for mercy, because as soon as even the slightest freedoms are allowed, he could jump at any opportunity to try out his next escape, and that's a security breach Americans aren't willing to risk on their own soil. At age 65, El Chapo now spends his days in a repetitive routine, living the life of endlessly separated isolation within the most secure prison environment on the planet. A far cry from the luxury women, lavish parties, and unbound wealth he formerly enjoyed, despite the lawless bloodshed his decisions inflicted across North America and Mexico. His story showcases the extreme lengths required to deter up-and-coming criminals constantly tempting fate through tried and tested criminal enterprises that make huge profits across both sides of the US-Mexico border, no matter how tirelessly any law enforcement try. For now, the United States has employed the harshest extremes of modern human caging capabilities against the iconic figurehead representing the overall cartel crisis taking over America's southern border. But whether it stands to disrupt or simply to mix up the current cartel rankings, the region will remain unstable. So long there is a demand for drugs, the cartels, and their leaders, and in this case, El Chapo, will always be able to benefit. El Chapo's cry for help, shockingly, has not fallen on deaf ears. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has not ignored or denied his plea and remains publicly open to the idea. The Mexican foreign minister, however, is not so keen on the idea, given El Chapo's history of tunneling and hiding in laundry carts. The president's position could also be more than meets the eye, with the constantly rocky relationship between Mexico and the United States, and a lot of it can be traced back to the border. Why could this be? Let's take a deeper look at the history between the border and why El Chapo moving back to Mexico would affect this. The relationship between the United States and Mexico has long been marked by tensions over issues like immigration, trade, and security along their shared border. This troubled history dates back centuries, but certain actions taken by both nations in recent years have worsened the problems between them. The Trump administration from 2017 to 2021 took an extremely strict stance against immigration from Mexico that seriously damaged relations between the two countries. President Donald Trump routinely demonized Mexican immigrants as criminals, drug dealers, and worse, and made building a wall along the entire southern border a major point of his presidency.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. It won't be.
Despite heavy opposition from Mexico, Trump used billions in federal funds to construct new barriers covering hundreds of miles of the border in an attempt to halt illegal border crossings and drug smuggling. This increased militarization of the border fueled a humanitarian crisis, with reports of migrants being detained in overcrowded facilities where they lacked basic sanitation and were denied proper medical care. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy led to thousands of migrant children being separated from their parents and held in detention away from their families. Images of kids confined in cages created an outrage and brought global outcry against the U.S. immigration methods. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration in 2020 brought in a public health order called Title 42 that allowed border control to immediately turn away migrants at the border without letting them apply for asylum, something not normally allowed under American and international law. over 1 million migrants were turned away under this policy before it was lifted in early 2023. Mexico also shares blame for the deteriorating relationship through its failure to combat powerful drug cartels that smuggle vast quantities of illegal substances across the border into American cities. Despite Mexico's government vowing to crack down on these criminal organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they remain in strong control. The steady flow of drugs fuels the addiction crisis taking over American communities, playing a major role in the ever-growing deaths recorded in the U.S. Mexico argues that the constant American demand is the root cause, driving the trafficking. While the U.S. has accused Mexico of not doing enough to take down major cartels responsible for waves of horrific violence within Mexico itself as they battle over key smuggling routes. Current Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has also criticized U.S. immigration policies, recently boycotting President Biden's 2023 Summit of the Americas over the exclusion of the authoritarian governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So while Mexico and the United States have close economic ties and a shared cultural history, the relationship has been defined by mistrust, conflict, and tit-for-tat actions that have tended to make tensions worse rather than bring about peace. Unless both nations take a more diplomatic, cooperative route going forward, their troubled partnership could remain problematic into the future. Given the troublesome history, this could show why the president is open to the idea of bringing back El Chapo. Maybe just to spite the US, as the state of relations between the two nations is already in such a bad place. Even though he's currently serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison over in the United States, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman still commands incredible power and influence through his former Mexican drug cartel. The diminutive former leader of the Sinaloa Cartel is potentially issuing a warning to American border troops. If he is not immediately extradited back to Mexico, his cartel will unleash an overwhelming flood of people, drugs, and violence across the US-Mexico border like nothing ever seen before. If so, US officials should take the threat seriously. While El Chapo has been locked away since his dramatic 2016 capture and extradition, the Sinaloa Cartel's operations have continued nearly untouched under new leadership by his eldest sons. The cartel is known to have vast resources, criminal reach extending across the Western world, and a complex logistical network that could potentially mobilize forces capable of causing chaos and instability along the US southern border. Here are just a few ways in which El Chapo could rain chaos down on the border. Building a human stampede. Through its well-established human trafficking networks in Mexico, Central America, and beyond, the Sinaloa Cartel would begin recruiting and transporting tens of thousands of migrants and refugees to staging areas near the US-Mexico border. These poor civilians would be offered a chance at a new life in America or even just a few $100s in cash to take part in a mass movement towards the border. Utilizing social media campaigns, narratives of seeking asylum from danger and poverty, and age-old tactics of exploitation, the cartel could quickly assemble an on-the-ground force of thousands of migrants by promising opportunity in the US. For those refusing, the arms of the cartel could turn to threats against their families or outright abductions to bolster their human ranks. This overwhelming human surge, comprising entire families with women and children, would be directed in multiple waves towards known crossing points and border cities like San Diego, El Paso, Laredo, and Brownsville. The goal, to utterly overwhelm and overrun the US Border Patrol's facilities and enforcement capacities in a short period of time. Once this inevitable humanitarian crisis erupted, with images of border authorities being crushed by unstoppable human waves broadcast across the world, and the US government would face immense pressure on what way they should deal with the constant wave after wave of people flooding the nation. The weapons escalation. But the human wave would be just the beginning. As border enforcement moved to confront and try to control the migrant flows, the next stage could begin. The introduction of weaponry into the crisis when armed cartel operatives mixed in among the migrant groups. The sudden escalation would shift the border crisis from a human wave into a full combat scenario, as these newly militia forces, using innocent migrants as human shields, opened fire on US troops. Armored convoys would attempt to blast through ports of entry and cross-border defenses. Rocket attacks could even target Border Patrol aircraft, trying to monitor and contain the uprising. US authorities would be forced into an unthinkable decision: unleash maximum force and firepower inevitably causing massive civilian casualties, or begin retreating and holding control of parts of the US-Mexico border to these hostile forces. Television cameras would broadcast every explosive moment of the unfolding chaos, violence, and death, inflaming domestic outrage, dividing U.S. political leadership, and severely straining the military's crisis response capabilities. Simultaneously, the Sinaloa cartel would ramp up its drug trafficking operations, moving unprecedented amounts of narcotics across whatever remaining open border areas they control. With border authorities focused on combating the crisis zones, they would aim to flood American cities and rural areas with fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and worsening the nation's drug crisis. If U.S. authorities failed to regain full control along the border after a few weeks, the cartel's drug shipments could include more substantial terror weapons like vehicle-borne IEDs, anti-aircraft missiles to cause further chaos and undermine American national security. Checkmate, El Chapo's release. This would all put overwhelming pressure on the U.S. government to cut its losses and agree to his release and extradition back to Mexico to once again take control of his criminal empire. From there, he could use his remaining influence to call off the border campaign and push for calm to be restored in exchange for Mexican authorities, leaving him untouched. The longer the U.S. delayed or refused El Chapo's extradition demand, the worse the border crisis and threat against America's homeland would escalate. And even if El Chapo is killed or permanently locked away, the crisis could spiral beyond anyone's control, becoming a full-fledged narco-terrorist insurgency seeking to destabilize the American government. Of course, these scenarios represent an absolute worst-case situation, where the criminal forces are operating at peak capability. The likelihood of the cartels pulling off such a catastrophic, multi-phased attack are definitely far-fetched, to say the least. However, the combination of the Sinaloa organization's resources, cross-border human trafficking infrastructure, weaponry, proven ability to corrupt officials on both sides of the border, and El Chapo's still feared reputation within the Mexican underworld makes his border destabilization possibility worth taking note of with deadly seriousness. On its surface, El Chapo's call for extradition to Mexico could be viewed as a legitimate cry for help regarding his well-being and treatment within the notoriously harsh supermax prison system in America. The conditions he now faces are extremely strict compared to his previously lavish lifestyle, leading the Sinaloa cartel's multi-billion-dollar criminal operations. So, from El Chapo's perspective, the Colorado supermax potentially represents inhumane, torturous constraints, more like psychological torture than standard incarceration. It completely deprives him of any remaining influence, comforts, or ability to continue managing his criminal empire's activities through bribes and unlawful privileges, as he formerly could buy in Mexico's notoriously corrupt prison system. Given these circumstances, there is a reasonable argument that El Chapo's desperate call to return to Mexico could stem from legitimate concerns over his standard human rights and well-being being severely violated by the so-called extreme protocols of the ADX Florence. If this psychological suffering persists long-term, it raises questions about potential cruel punishment violations of the Eighth Amendment. However, considering El Chapo's extensive history of extreme violence, wide-scale corruption, and repeated efforts to escape from Mexican prisons through bribes and tunnels, no matter the security protocols, his extradition demand must be viewed by American authorities as a likely ploy to simply resume his usual prison escapes activities again, rather than a legitimate plea over inhumane treatment. It was precisely El Chapo's ability to continuously undertake these escapes from Mexico's maximum security prisons through bribing officials that eventually led to his extradition to the United States criminal justice system in the first place. Despite being locked in Mexico's supposedly most secure facility in Altiplano, El Chapo still managed to plan and undertake the construction of an elaborate mile-long tunnel to break out of the complex in a daring escape. Given his incredible wealth, estimated in the billions, and far-reaching criminal influence, there is effectively no Mexican prison that could reliably contain El Chapo from continuing to oversee the Sinaloa cartel's expansive drug empire trafficking narcotics into American cities and fueling addiction crises. This reality of being unable to stop such a powerful kingpin within Mexico's corrupt prison system was a major power behind his controversial extradition to the United States. So regardless of El Chapo's concerns over the Colorado supermax conditions, potentially allowing human rights violations, American officials have a strong realistic and moral reasoning for imposing the harshest psychological restrictions upon him within the ADX Florence's most extreme isolation protocols. Their aim is to completely sever any remaining chance for the dangerous kingpin to potentially plan and take on any escapes, carry on his criminal activities, continue violence, or project power and corruption from within the U.S. prison system through bribery, as he proved capable of doing over and over again in Mexico.
Drug cartels in Mexico have been terrorizing Americans for decades. We're going to unleash the fury and might of the United States against these cartels.
Based on El Chapo's extensive history overseeing the violent Sinaloa cartel's operations that left tens of thousands of dead across Mexico, many would argue he has definitely lost any right to his own humane treatment while imprisoned. The billions he made from trafficking cocaine, heroin, meth, and other deadly drugs into American cities and rural areas over decades devastated communities and ruined countless lives through addiction and overdoses. Over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2022 alone, many linked to the same narcotics trafficked by cartels like El Chapo's criminal empire. So, while international laws and human rights organizations promote for the maintaining of basic standards of dignity for all prisoners, regardless of their crimes, the moral debate rages over whether individuals like El Chapo should still be granted these considerations given the staggering scale of human suffering and casualties they ruthlessly caused in endlessly pursuing wealth and power through the illegal drug trade. The dilemma shows the larger, turbulent relationship between the United States and Mexico over border security, immigration issues, and the war on drugs. Should America take an even stricter, hard-line stance in aggressively defending its sovereignty and protecting its citizens from external criminal threats and narco-violence at all costs? Or does that one-sided militaristic approach run the risk of further worsening the very cycles of instability, lawlessness, and humanitarian crises it aims to quell along both sides of the border without any diplomatic resolution?
Where some of these suspected cartel gunmen from Mexico are firing their weapons towards our agents.
Indeed, El Chapo's own potential threat and ability to unleash potential waves of chaos, weaponry, and human floods across the US-Mexico border if his extradition demand is not met illustrates just how combustible and delicate the current border crisis situation remains due to lack of trust and cooperation between the nations. The volatile standoff evokes the same crucial tensions over economic policies, immigration enforcement, cartel violence, and border security that have defined the long-troubled US-Mexico relationship and continued the vicious cycles of conflict for decades. It remains an open ethical question whether extending human rights and humane treatment, even to criminal masterminds like El Chapo, could open new diplomatic avenues towards stabilizing both nations' mutual security and economic interests by finally controlling the lawlessness along the border, or if the United States government is indeed morally and pragmatically justified in taking absolutely whatever extreme legal measures are required, no matter how harsh or controversial, to fully neutralize the ability of powerful kingpins like El Chapo to potentially project any further violence, drug addictions, and human suffering into American society, regardless of ethical constraints. As the brutal decades of cartel wars and unrelenting drug trafficking have shown, the border crisis has long since devolved into a harsh reality where human rights are often simply nothing but an ideal concealed by demands for straight-down-the-line common sense. His arrest and life sentence were celebrated as a major victory in the war on drugs. However, his imprisonment did little to slow the flow of illegal drugs into the United States and other countries. New leaders quickly filled the power vacuum, continuing the vicious cycle of violence and corruption. So, was locking up El Chapo for life in the ADX Supermax prison in Colorado the right move? The ADX is one of the most secure and restrictive prisons on Earth, with inmates kept in near total isolation for all hours of the day, -1. For El Chapo, these heavy-handed measures were seen as necessary to silence him and prevent any further running of the Sinaloa cartel from inside prison walls. But is such extreme punishment justified? Or is it just cruel and inhumane treatment? Should El Chapo face the ADX's notoriously harsh conditions as punitive sentencing for his crimes? Or are the strict controls an unethical form of soundproofing to prevent him from communicating with the outside world? What do you think is the right approach? Is this the last we will hear from El Chapo? I think not.